going to talk about the history of gin, and particularly of the first gin craze, which is sort of 1730s, 1740s. There's another one in the sort of 1830s, and arguably you could say that people have gone a bit gin crazy again at the moment, or at least it's become fashionable again. It seems to come and go in fashion terms. But the first and biggest is definitely the 1730s, 1740s. It does come into the country a little bit before that. It comes into the country first in the late 17th century. From the mid-17th century, the Dutch have been brewing gin, and this is probably actually where the expression Dutch courage comes from. Dutch courage is not any old alcohol, it is specifically gin, because a lot of continental Europe wars, where a lot of soldiers were drinking the stuff, and a lot of our soldiers were going out there and meeting Dutch soldiers and drinking with them, and ended up drinking gin as well. On top of that, after the Restoration in 1660, you get a lot of nobles coming back from where they've been in exile in France, and they come back with a taste largely for French drinks, for champagne and for brandy, which is the spirit of choice for the French at that point. Nonetheless, you do start to get gin coming back largely through the taste buds of the soldiers. In 1688, William and Mary come to the throne. Now this is William of Orange, this is the Dutch connection, and they are going to bring Dutch tastes to bear. And the start of their reign is actually the peak of beer production, but things are about to change. There is a rapid drop in beer drinking as stronger things become available. William himself was a gin drinker, and in his wars all of his soldiers were gin drinkers. And he had a plan for the agriculture of England, that he wanted the whole country to grow a surplus of grain. And in bad years, that grain would then be available for people to eat, to prevent starvation, which was a genuine problem some winters in that time. And then whenever there was surplus, no problem, we'll just turn it all into gin. He saw that as a sort of win-win situation. In the bad years, they'd have to eat some grain that wasn't the best quality, stuff that would otherwise go into making gin. But generally, you know, this is a positive thing. So he very much promotes the making of gin and the producing of the wheat for it. He keeps gin making completely untaxed and unregulated. He said that anyone can set up a distillery as long as you give 10 days notice to the excise people. It didn't have a monopoly in any particular guild or anything like that. He also banned French brandy, which was the sort of competitor drink. And for quite a long time after that, it was either illegal or at least ideologically unsound to be drinking any sort of alcohol from France, and quite often stuff from Spain either. So trade with Holland is a good way to get it. And he said that any inn that brewed gin would be exempt from having to billet troops. And in some bits of the country, that's genuinely a big incentive. So think of London in about 1700. There are 600,000 people, give or take, which is 30 times the size of the next biggest place in England. It's huge. And it's the largest city in Europe. It is becoming now a place that is big enough that you could disappear, that you could not be recognised as you walk down the street. A place that you could move from one side of the city to the other and take a new identity. And it's a place with an awful lot of poor people, because a lot of influx of new people, the parish poor law system's broken down. Most people weren't born there, which means that the system wasn't set up to support them at all, because you were supposed to go to the place that you were born for your parish relief. And one could argue there is a definite hunger for a drink that will make you forget your troubles cheaply. And that's what you get in gin. In 1700, about 1.2 million gallons of gin were drunk. By 1743, it's over 7 million gallons. And that's just the legitimate stuff, and there's a lot more being sold without anyone knowing about it. And 1 in 4 houses in London in 1743 sold gin, which is staggering, isn't it? You have a point where you have to think that most of the population was permanently semi-drunk for about a decade. Children were being given it to keep them quiet. Breastfeeding mothers were passing it on to their children in their milk. It helps that it is quite easy to make, and it also helps that you can make it really, really strong. So all you need to do is buy a gallon of raw grain spirit from the malt distillers, take it home and distill it again. If you do that, it comes out much, much stronger. They think it may come out at about 80%, which is obviously twice that of modern gin. So you've got 80% alcohol. And then, of course, you add your flavours. You add in juniper, most commonly. That's where the word gin comes from. It is from the juniper berry, which gives it a sort of bitter edge. But they would also add terps and sulfuric acid quite happily to give it extra kick. One quack recipe of the time, for instance, takes your basic gin and adds oil of vitriol, oil of almond, oil of turpentine, spirits of wine, lump sugar, lime water, rose water, alum and salt of tartar. I mean, yum. Beer used to be adulterated, but not to anything like that level. That's scary, scary stuff. And gin shops sprout up everywhere. So this new demand. You didn't need anything special, you just needed an empty spare room in your house. London Magazine said at the time, it is sold in some part or other of almost every house, frequently in cellars and sometimes in the garret. Or, of course, you didn't need to go to a shop at all, you could just find a street cellar. There were loads of people, generally amongst the most poor and bedraggled of the citizens of London, who would be just carrying around a few gallons of gin and would quite happily sell you some. This is the first urban drug, and it's the first urban drug panic. So it hits the streets and the authorities have not expected it to explode in this way, and they don't know what to do about it. There are no laws involved, there are no social norms on how you drink it and how much you drink. A lot of people didn't know how strong it was going to be and didn't know the effect it was going to have. The standard measure for this stuff, bearing in mind it's 80%, the standard measure is a quarter pint. I haven't done the maths on quite how many units of alcohol that is, but it's no small number, especially given that it was apparently quite often bought and drunk in pints. Pint of 80% ABV. And people did die, you know. That amount, if you're not used to it, is lethal, or can be. And like I say, if you didn't already know that it was that strong, you wouldn't necessarily know. There's a story in 1741, there's a group of Londoners who met a farm labourer just on the outskirts of town, and they persuaded him for a laugh to down 4 pints of gin. Oh, go on, have another one, mate, it's on us. And they'd give him a shilling for each pint of drink he could get through. And, you know, shillings, good money back then. This made him very happy. So 4 pints later, as the story was reported at the time, which no sooner had he done, he fell down and died immediately. This should not be a surprise. He probably just had no idea that it was that much stronger than the ale that he drank every day. He'd be able to tell it was stronger, but not by that much. And it spreads, and it spreads amongst the urban poor. And it was very frightening to the upper and middle classes who were watching it spread among the urban poor. They sort of thought that this was a thing that existed entirely amongst the urban poor, that gin shops were the hangouts for the worst of society, and they thought that the upper classes were able to drink responsibly, and they had their beer and their wine and their brandy, but of course the lower classes couldn't get drunk without it being a mark of excess and crime and destitution. And there is something to that, simply because the stuff was so cheap compared to the alternatives. If you wanted to get blotto and forget the day, gin was the way to go. And it also has the effect of suppressing the appetite. So if you're poor and hungry, then that might be, again, something quite appealing. Might mean you couldn't afford to buy any more food at the same time, but there you go. There are tales at the time of people feeding their meat to the dogs, and dairy farmers tipping unsold milk into the streets because everyone was spending all their money on gin instead. And tales spread and were in the papers of people like the story of William Byrd, who left his house in Kensington for a day in the charge of his maidservant Jane. And Jane immediately went to a gin shop, met up with a drummer of the guards of her acquaintance, as well as a chimney sweeper and a woman traveller. And the four of them went back to William Bird's house, since it was otherwise empty, drank gin together for 6 hours, and then all stripped and went to bed together. Until a mob, hearing of this affair, surrounded the door and disturbed the happy pairs. Imagine the hangover the next morning after that little scene. But from the point of view of William Byrd, how are you ever going to trust leaving your servant in charge again? You know, these lower class people, all they're going to do is get drunk and invite strangers into your house for an orgy. You increasingly on the streets get unconscious drunks just lying around, sometimes lying around naked because they'd sold their clothes for gin. We have to be a bit careful because, of course, there are voices of moral panic in here that leave some of these accounts. But there are enough of these stories coming from enough different places and enough places you wouldn't necessarily expect to be getting hysterical about it that, you know, there's something to it, I think. There's a description of a dram shop in East Smithfield in 1736 that lain in heaps together promiscuously, men, women and children, till they recover their senses, when they proceed to drink on, or having spent all they had, go and find the wherewithal to return to the same drunken pursuits, and how they acquire more money the sessions paper too often acquits. As in they're taking up theft or prostitution or whatever. It's the heroin of its day, isn't it? It's all the worse, and seen as all the worse by those who are panicking about this, because it is a drink very much favoured by women. And there are pamphlets written about how it drives women to prostitution, to unwanted pregnancies, to damaged newborns, which of course is potentially true if they've been drinking too much while they're pregnant. People were aware of that. And this is how it comes to be called Mother's Ruin. Mary Eastwick was a notorious story of the time. She was a nursemaid and she was passed out drunk from gin, and the child in her care stumbled into the fire and caught fire. And when the neighbours came in, the child was dead, and Mary was also on fire and semi-conscious. And the coroner said that she had previously been, and probably still was, a good woman. The problem was all owing to that pernicious liquor. Another woman was reported to have become so drunk that she mistook a child she was nursing for a log of wood and chucked it in the fire deliberately. That one might be a bit far-fetched, but you can see how, you know, these stories give a picture. But the one that really made people start to think, the one that really got, made it hit great public consciousness, was the story of Judith Defoe. And in 1734, Judith had a 2-year-old girl, Mary, and she said she couldn't afford to keep her. The gin habit wouldn't help with that, but she said she couldn't afford to keep her, so she sent her to the parish workhouse. One day she went to the workhouse and said she wanted to take Mary out for the day. It's January, so she's grabbed hold of Mary and they're going to go for a nice walk somewhere. Instead, with the 2-year-old in tow, Judith meets with a crony and they sit and drink until they run out of money. So how are they going to get more money? Mary had been given some nice clothes. There you go then. So what they do is they go to a ditch, strip her all her clothes and walk away with the clothes to sell. But she wouldn't stop crying, so as she's crying at her mother's back, her mother then loses her temper completely, goes back and strangles her. After that, in Judith's own words, "We went together and sold the coat and stay for a shilling, and petticoats and stockings for a groat. We parted the money and joined together for a quartern of gin." A few hours later she went back to the workhouse and confessed what she'd done. She was tried and very soon hanged. So that became a story that everybody knew about, for obvious reasons. The gossip about something like that this was the worst thing that you could possibly do to yourself and to your child. It may not have been entirely the fault of the gin. Judith's mother did later say that she'd never quite been in her right mind, that one. And we do have to be careful, as I say, to separate out the exaggerations of moral panic from the truth. There were 2 women who were said to have drunk so much that they spontaneously combusted. This doesn't seem likely, But again, it was well enough believed that the Royal Society discussed it in 1745, discussed whether it's possible to drink enough that you become completely flammable in that way. Nonetheless, Judith's case was all, it all came out in court. It's obviously pretty close to what happened, and it did help inspire more legislation. And the effect on London in the broad scale was obvious. The number of patients in London hospitals we can take as a figure, and that skyrockets. One doctor said that this comes from the melancholy consequences of gin drinking, principally. Even though this is a time of relatively good health, relatively cheap food, not a time of famine, for instance, it's not, you know, there's no more plagues by this point. Nonetheless, the population of London falls, and we have to think this is a good chunk of why. So the government are going to want to regulate that. The first attempt to regulate comes a few years earlier in 1729, when things weren't actually quite as bad. The first Gin Act taxed and regulated gin, which they described as a strong spirit flavoured with juniper. So a lot of people at that point, what are you going to do? You can't sell stuff flavoured with juniper. You just take the juniper flavour out and keep selling exactly the same product otherwise. And particularly nice is that they tended to sarcastically sell this stuff created by the law as Parliamentary Brandy. So that didn't change a lot. They tried again 4 years later. Very little happened. There were just too many retailers, too many distributors. By 1739, there were estimated 8,600 spirit sellers. And that would be just the ones they could pin down easily. There'd be a lot more. But after that Judith Defoe case, the government really had to do something. It was such a cause célèbre, they had to get on it. So what you got then was the 1736 Act, Gin Act. All gin sellers needed a licence for £50 per year, and that's a huge sum of money. And they had to also pay another 20 shillings per gallon in duty on it. There were a system of informers set up, that informers would be paid good money if they informed on unlicensed sellers of gin. Brandy shops were encouraged as an alternative, although that did come across as very middle class, so not many people went for that. But this law, for some reason, was quite badly publicised, and when people did hear of it, they tended to hear of it via popular ballads that often said that gin was going to be banned completely. As far as a lot of people were concerned, yeah, if we have to pay £50 to be able to sell it, you might as well get rid of it completely, right? Several informers were murdered. Some other informers tried to run a protection racket in a sort of, you know, pay me more than the government would pay me, or I'll go and tell them all about you. And many known informers kept being found mysteriously beaten to death. Just before the date that this law came in, of course, what you get is a massive binge. People drinking as much as they can until they aren't supposed to be doing it anymore, except from these few licensed premises. Even because people thought that it was being banned completely because it hadn't been explained properly. The Daily Gazette reported that even some owners believed this, that they were being banned from doing it entirely. And it reports of an owner putting out all the barrels saying, "Is this not a barbarous and cruel thing that I must not be permitted to fill them again?" Which the real answer is, well, you can, but it'll be £50, and most of them wouldn't have had that money to spend. Another thing that happened as a consequence of this, and the consequence of everyone believing that it was a complete ban, were mass processions through town, which were known as the funeral for Madame Geneva. Madame Geneva obviously being the spirit of gin, the word Geneva being juniper again, where you could see people, and it genuinely happened that they'd get a coffin and they'd parade through the town with this coffin. They're almost all in London, but there is one in Bath, which does show that the phenomena is not entirely localised to London. Only Britain did that thing of personifying gin as a woman, creating Madame Geneva. It is not an international figure. There are people in Britain who wrote poems and plays to the inspiration they got from her. It's almost like the sort of thing that surrounds absinthe 150 years later. And yet several times there are these funerals with hundreds of people turn up to watch, obviously because it's quite a spectacle. very few licences, of course, are sold. A bit more duty starts to be gathered. People don't mind so much paying that, but very few licences are sold. Clearly everyone is just starting to do it illegally. It also, having duty on things, just encourages people to smuggle more. So how are people going to get around this? Well, there's a chap called Dudley Bradstreet who has a marvellous plan, an ingenious plan. He noticed that the Act gave no authority for anyone to break down a door to search for gin. And he also noticed that any informer on a gin shop had to know the name of the place who was renting the establishment before they would be able to snitch on it. So he got an acquaintance to rent a house, and the acquaintance otherwise stayed out of it completely. So his name wasn't known by anybody. This was in the Blue Anchor Alley. He bought a pub type sign called the Cat. He nailed up the sign of the cat, and he nailed it flat against the wall and put a little lead pipe coming out of it under its paw, and through the wall that went to a funnel. And he bought £13 worth of gin. He spent all the money he had on gin and got a few people to spread word of mouth that the gin would be sold by the cat the following day. And it had an openable jaw. And what happened was people had to put money in its mouth and then close it, and someone would reach, take that money away and then tip the correct amount of gin through the funnel to their waiting jug or whatever. And no one on either side saw enough of what was going on to be able to press charges. Nobody could break and enter the building, nobody could inform on the building because they didn't know who was renting it, and nobody actually saw the gin being tipped in, and that was enough to get around the legislation. It's very cunning loophole picking. But this thing was known as the Puss and Mew machine. Initially, nobody came for the first 3 hours, and he was absolutely in despair that he'd spent all his money on setting up this scheme and nothing was going to happen. When, after 3 hours, there was a little chink of the money and a voice says, "Puss, give me 2 pennyworth of gin." He tipped it down the funnel. He got 6 shillings the first night, 30 shillings the night after, and then £3 or £4 a night after that. And did very well out of it. Apparently he spent the whole lot on haws and oysters, that being his tastes. To each their own, I suppose. And yeah, these Puss and Mew machines then spread right across London because people have worked out that this really is a way to circumvent the Act if they get their gin from a mechanical cat. Albeit that there's somebody in the background tipping the stuff, that doesn't matter. There is only one surviving Puss and Mew machine, and even that there is some speculation as to whether it's the real thing or whether it's a late Victorian copy of one. But it's very cool anyway, and you should look it up. Other ways of avoiding the law. Well, you might claim that you're making wine and then sell gin laced with wine. Brandy shops started selling something that they called sangaree, which they claimed was a kind of spiced wine, but it was actually gin with wine and spice. And a lot of new names came up for it, so that you didn't have to ask for gin or Madame Geneva. You could ask for Cuckold's Comfort, or Lost Shift, or Lady's Delight, Colic Water, King Theodore of Corsica. There's a lot of options there. Other people simply called themselves chemists and apothecaries and put a label on the bottle saying, oh, only take 3 spoonfuls per day, which is a clever way of getting around it. No, I'm not selling gin, I'm selling medicine. And in fact, in the first 2 years of this Act, even though it had come about because of the moral horror that was associated with Judith Dalforth, 2 licences were sold in the whole of London. And there were 12,000 convictions for breaking the law. You can see how well that's working out for them. Clearly, it's unenforceable. Lord Carteret noted that people could see that they could evade it, and so they did. And therefore the government had no chance. He says, no private man, no under-officer durst inform, no magistrate durst punished, and without being de-witted by the mob as he passed by the street. Having the wits knocked out of you. So after trying that for a while and that doesn't work, the government then tries a different tack. The government decided they were just going to tax gin just a little bit. Not enough that it would stop anyone from having their gin shop, but just a little bit. And then they gradually increased the tax by increments, getting people into the system, getting their names registered and their locations registered with that first one, and then gradually increasing it, and then increasing it quite a lot, but by that point everyone's in the system. Another thing that helped was they made drinking debt unrecoverable by law. And in a system which relies on credit quite so much, it was really useful for people to know that they could get their drinking debt back. But no, if it was a drinking debt, you spent it, it was gone. And then in the 1750s, there finally is that bad harvest that William was trying to prepare for in the first place, and suddenly there is a better use for all that surplus grain. Less gin was made for a few years because the harvests were bad, and people do need bread. And then the people on the whole moved on from this particular craze. It was still very popular as a drink throughout the century, and you know, every time the taxes go up, so does the gin smuggling go up. But the worst sort of time when it all went mad is past by the 1750s. It was never a drink for the upper class through the whole of this, and it was not considered a respectable drink until well into the 20th century. In the 19th century, Victorian fans of it would even invent pseudonyms to be able to drink it undisturbed. They would call it Nig, which sounds a little unfortunate to our ears, but as I say, there is a second gin craze in the 1830s that I might tell you about another day. And that point at the end, 1751, so just as it's starting to tail off, is when Hogarth's Beer Street and Gin Lane is produced. By that point, Hogarth has been working for a long time. His work is getting quite didactic, and here he's very much responding to that moral panic. So that one child's being thrown, another is being fed gin. There are people lining up at the pawnbroker's shop, people being buried. The only shops which are doing well seem to be the pawnbrokers and the undertakers. And you can compare that with what he thinks of Beer Street, in which it is all, everyone is full of life. It's all very jolly, and there is happiness and wealth and you know, good health everywhere. The Union flag is flying. The pawnbrokers are the shop that are in disrepair. And there's lots of other English virtuous things going on around. You know, there's street sellers, there's joints of meat, beef and Britannia and all that, rather than gin, which of course is portrayed as being foreign muck. So gin not only is the heroine of its day, it's foreign heroine of its day as well, which is another reason why the upper class squire is going to very much disapprove of it. So there you go. That is a tour of the moral panic that surrounded gin, and the fact that the moral panic was pretty well justified in a lot of cases around gin at the time. It was, as I say, twice the strength that it is now, so you're probably safe if you want to go and have a, you know, please drink responsibly, is all I can say. Do not throw your baby into the fire thinking that it might be firewood. Do not sell all of its clothes for booze, and you'll probably be all right. See you later.